Thank you to all our speakers, and following the format of the other sessions, we're now going to have a response. And our respondent is Alnoor Mitha, who is Senior Research Fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University and Research Centre Leader for Asian Cultures there. He was previously the director of Shisha, the International Agency for Contemporary South Asian Crafts and Visual Arts, between 2002 and 2011. And Alnoor has also been invited to create the Colombo Art Biennial in Sri Lanka in this year, November this year. So a busy summer ahead. Alnoor.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I'd like to thank our distinguished guest here, also Sarah, Hamad, and Nadia, for hosting us. Okay. The early 1990s was a pivotal period in which the British South Asian art scene flourished, with numerous artistic exchanges and a two-way traffic between Britain and South Asia. There were a number of emerging visual arts organizations and individuals challenging the historical epistemology of the colonial mindset and promoting South Asian cultures in the north of England. Several artists and curators from culturally diverse backgrounds started their independent journeys to find a platform to either present their artistic work or to find other means to which to present it, sparking my journey as a curator of exhibitions. The reason I'm partly using my own career as an exemplar is because it perfectly mirrors the paradigm on shifts taking place in the arts world in Britain. My aim was to support the South Asian Artistic Network and connect artists with local and international networks. I've devoted most of my life to support South Asian artists in Britain and the international diaspora. In 1983, I completed my undergraduate fine arts training under Anish Kapoor and other tutors at the University of Wolverhampton. During 1984, I was awarded the Commonwealth Scholarship to study postgraduate studies at Baroda in India. I was very fortunate to have such a distinguished group of art tutors such as Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and Nasrin Muhammadi, to name but a few. When I got back to Britain in 1986, I co-founded Zamana Art Studio in Manchester with artist and poet John Lyons. During the same time, I was showcasing my work both nationally and internationally. In 1987, I had a one-person show at the Horizon Gallery in London. I began my personal journey as curator during 1991-96 at the Huddersfield Art Gallery, where I co-curated Tampered Surface, work by Iftikhar Dadi and other distinguished artists from Pakistan. In 1994, both Salima Hashmi and Nima Puvaya Smith co-curated An Intelligent Rebellion, Women Artists of Pakistan, at Cartwright Hall, Bradford. We collectively played a major role in shaping South Asian histories by hosting seminal exhibitions in the north of England. In 1996 to 1999, I was appointed as curator at Huddersfield Art Gallery, Gallery Oldham, where I focused on presenting the work by young and mid-career South Asian artists, including the work by Gurminder Sikand, Jay Chauhan, Shaila Kumari Burman, Naiza Khan, Balraj Khanna, and many other artists. In 2001, I founded Shisha, which was funded by the Arts Council of England, the International Agency for Contemporary South Asian Crafts and Visual Arts. Shisha was established in Manchester to program a broad range of exhibitions, artist residencies, curatorial laboratories, symposia, publications, international curatorial study visits, and collaborative projects to open creative and challenging perceptions surrounding South Asian artistic, cultural, and socio-political discourses. Currently, as Sarah mentioned, I'm a senior research fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University. As a respondent to Eva Benshiva, Naiza Khan, Karen Zitzwitz's papers, I will summarize key critical and specific examples raised by them in the context of their presentations. This, alongside my own historical and contextual relationship to the general topic of this conference, showing, telling, seeing, exhibiting South Asia in Britain, 1900 to now, will focus on these arguments and examples raised by the speakers. In addition, I will be drawing on my own experience and history establishing Shisha 2001 to 2011, curating a major international showcase, Art South Asia, and founding the Asia Triennial Manchester during 2008 to present. I'd like to firstly respond to Eva's papers. She presents an excellent synopsis of events that happened during the 1990s. She brings multiple examples of both international and British artists to demonstrate that, and I quote, well-known museums in Britain have allowed artistic residencies and temporary projects to take place amidst their displays and draw materials from their archives, end of quote, and to interrogate the old colonial style museum and establishments. She gives a notable example of the African-American artist Fred Wilson, where, I quote, in 1992, a huge sign was hanging from the facade of the Maryland Historical Society announcing that another history was now being told inside. The sign referred to African-American artist Fred Wilson's exhibition project Mining the Museum, which presented the museum's collection in a new critical light. This critical light extended to British artists, including the work by Sutapa Biswas and Suman Biswas, Keith Piper, Sonia Boyce, and joint ventures from Morty Roti, Palomi Desai, and Dan Saul, and many others. The works by these predominantly South Asian artists challenged political and cultural issues by utilizing vibrant, interactive, or participatory installations that had not been presented before in the museums. I wanted to interrogate this further and asked artist Sutapa Biswas for further details about her work, and her response was, and I quote, "In regard to my own work at Pitt Rivers Museums, I could add that the context of this slide projection installation work was based on a very well-known Victorian idiom, tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, Richmond, poorman, beggarman, thief. In the context of my projection, the words which were formerly while Helvetica font were projected on continuous loop onto the sail of a boat suspended in mid-air and positioned centrally within the exhibition display and collection at Pitt Rivers Museum. Within the loop, the sequence of words well timed in punctuated format to follow each other as if in one's mind's eye the words were being spoken aloud. But without sound, symbolically and conceptually, central to this sequence was the fact that the work, thief, was absent from the sequence. In viewing this work and mouthing in one's mind's eye, the idiom as it unfolded was key to the viewer's realization that the work, like an object purloined by a thief or thieves, was missing from the Victorian taxonomy. The Pitt Rivers Museum, I understand from research I had undertaken at the museum in advance to making my installation, has in its collection over 25,000 objects amassed from around the globe. The boat or vessel became a conceptual gesture in symbolizing or referencing the history of empire and the trade goods. End of quote. Another example by Eva is, and I quote, great exhibitions in 1851 and the colonial and India exhibitions of 1886, in which artifact and people from the British Raj was showcased as part of the displays, end of quotes. These binary projects were so different in terms of the historical milieu, yet very challenging about appropriation in our contemporary times. In other words, the museums in Britain during the late 1800s were promoting exotic treasures of the empire, whereas in the 1990s, artists challenged the colonialist narrative through the eye of the immigrant, whose ancestry probably came from the former colony. Eva probes further critical questions, while highlighting the conceptual importance of Priceless as a contemporary inquiry to colonial practices of exhibiting South Asia and Britain. Do such projects indeed achieve the goals of making disruptive existing formations of knowledge in museums' collections? She continues, should we expect contemporary art to produce actual changes in the archives, displays, and the outreach agendas of the museum? These questions are of great relevance and significance. My first response is that the cultural intervention that examines any cultural intervention that examines the role of colonial museums is positive, bringing new and refreshing ideas that not only mend old mindsets, but also confronts curatorial attitudes. These ideas can turn into new and viable projects that can ultimately transform old archives. My second response is that artists are like magicians, cultivating new ideas, able to transform and challenge old museums' collections into something extraordinary. A notable example is the work by the renowned Pakistani artist Rashid Rana. During 2010, the Musée Gourmet in Paris, a leading Asian art museum, opened its doors to contemporary Asian art for the first time since its inception in 1998. Rana represented a perpetual paradox, where the director, Jacques G., stated that, and I quote, "The museum is much more than a safety deposit box for antiques. In view of the value of the Asian dynamic in our modern-day world, where Asian cultures are for the first time in Western history making a place for themselves that grows larger every day, the time has come, we believe, to reflect on the and reconsider our notion of the museum," end of quote. Rana's work was beautifully curated and brought a new creative synergy to the museum. The Nefast Journal critiqued Rana's show with questions: what does tradition mean to contemporary art today? Can a new and alternative history of art be conceived by transforming our visions of the present? Is the West finally seeing the East through indigenous eyes? We can discuss these and other questions later. The second paper by Naiza Khan and Karen Zitzwitz on the nodal connections brings an overview of the international artistic practice that has been supported by Triangle Network, made up by clusters of artists and artistic communities based in South Asia. These are still very much active and engaging with the international exchange program in South Asia, namely Korj in India, Vasal in Pakistan, Brito in Bangladesh, Tithra in Sri Lanka. And there are other South Asian networks that have been established in Nepal, and which you mentioned, Afghanistan, and have brought artistic exchanges that most probably failed to receive much publicity. In 1982, the Triangle Network was established for a meaningful discourse between South Asia and Britain. A few years later, interesting artistic networks began emerging in India. Examples include Ajay Lakhanpal, an industrialist and philanthropist who launched artists' residency program in Goa. The aim of the residency was to bring established artists together with emerging new talent. I was invited to participate on producing new work with eminent artists such as Nalini Malani, Nilima Sheikh, Krishna Kumar, and Surdasan Chetty. To continue with this collaborative process in India, artist Vivan Sundaram was instrumental not only organizing the International Artist Workshop in the idyllic town of Kasoli, India, but also curating seminal exhibitions such as the 7 Indian sculptors with work by artists including Pushpa Mala, N.N. Rimzan, Alex Matthew, shown at the Lalit Kala Academy in New Delhi. Approximately 2 decades later, and after founding Shisha, I started collaborating with a broad range of organizations, including with Professor Jay Chauhan, Director of Center for International Research, based at Liverpool John Moores University. We set our own network and jointly invited several South Asian artists for the first time to the north of England, including Imran Qureshi from Pakistan, Rekha Roditya, India, and Chandragupta Tenwara, Sri Lanka. Similar to the Triangle Network, our aim was to create a platform to intersect artistic ideas with practical workshops, hoping to benefit local students whilst publicizing the work of predominant South Asian artists in Britain. I've always been interested in building collaborative projects through lasting relationships with partner venues and wider artistic networks, both nationally and internationally. This was a major aim of Shisha. In 2002, Shisha planned and initiated Art South Asia, a complex and ambitious series of exhibitions and residencies commissioning international curators such as Mansoor al-Islam from Bangladesh, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and Jyotindra Jain, India, Salima Hashmi and Kudus Mirza from Pakistan, and Shamini Perere from UK and Sri Lanka, to curate exhibitions at venues cited in Oldham, Manchester, Preston, and Liverpool. These series of exhibitions were later discussed and contextualized in the multiple perspective conference held at Manchester Art Gallery. Curators, artists, critics, and art professionals from South Asia, Europe, and United States gave insights into the visual cultures of the subcontinent and its diasporas. My vision was to establish a creative case for showcasing high-quality contemporary visual arts with a regional and local focus. With the success of Art South Asia, the process of connecting international artists within a local cultural framework and opening creative dialogue generated a lot of enthusiasm and debates around South Asian cultures. As director of Shisha for 10 years, I built strong local and international networks within artists, curators, policymakers, and funders, and successfully delivered multiple projects, including the award-winning Asia Triennial, Manchester, or ATM. The inaugural ATM-08 program was underpinned by the artistic theme of protest. This provided an inclusive curatorial context which held both local and global significance. It evoked Manchester's radical political and social history, reflected new artistic practice, and sought resonance between Manchester and Asia. ATM-08 used a unique technique, bringing together a community of curators from the gallery venues from across the city, and provided a curatorial framework that allowed individual curators to research and devise their own distinctive yet interrelated exhibitions and events. The program featured venue-based exhibitions, site-specific new commissions, a series of international artist residencies, talks, screenings, workshops, outdoor performances, tea house discussions, symposiums, and publicly cited works by artists from South Asia and other parts of Asia, including China, Hong Kong, and so on. ATM-11 and most recent edition, ATM-14, built the foundation of ATM-08. It involved all the original partners, as well as many new museums, galleries, and key cultural sites in Manchester, Bury, and Cheshire. Projects such as the ATM represent significant knowledge exchange and demonstrable social and economic impact. A diverse demographic based in the Manchester area have been involved in a variety of roles. Such involve members of the audiences or participants in the workshops at the Imperial War Museum North, the procession for Manchester's school children, or groups held for Asian women to encourage social cohesion. Importantly, projects such as the ATM showcase fruitful interactions between artists from South Asia and artists based in the UK, and importantly, provide role models for arts practice, including positive growth in the status of women, which is reflected in successful female artists in both specialist audiences and also for the UK's diverse communities, including recent migrations. In conclusion, what are the lessons that we get from all the papers here? But I just want to basically say that several museums in the north of England are promoting South Asian exhibitions without substantial knowledge on South Asian cultures or the will to collaborate with South Asian experts. We need to bring our cultural voices and expertise to the mainstream platform. Unfortunately, with the events with Brexit, we are living in a very challenging time period. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers and our respondent for making us think, about site specificity and that relationship between locality and wider global context. So I'm going to open it to the floor and ask if there are any questions straight away for our speakers. Let's see everyone's... Oh, here we go. Lotta. Yeah, you're ready. Great.
Myself. I was interested in both your papers. There's a mention of the Goethe Institute, and I'm wondering what these international cultural organizations that we find in most capitals across South Asia are actually contributing to the stories that we're telling here.
Yeah, I could talk about Pakistan specifically. I think the Goethe has been really instrumental and really positive throughout the 80s. And that's been largely because the heads, the cultural or the head of the Goethe Institute in Lahore or Karachi have been really interested in culture and promoting actually understanding what's happening on the ground and then giving spaces to practitioners to do things. So I think one of the things that I first felt when I got to Karachi in 1990 was that the Goethe Institute was really instrumental in, and I think also for the reason that often other cultural spaces were not activated in the same way. They didn't enable, and they couldn't because of the strife in the city, for example. So the Goethe ended up often being a kind of oasis where artists and writers and the workshops that they held were kind of encouraged. And I would just say again that it was the heads of those particular institutions that really promoted and facilitated this sort of work.
In the case of the artwork that I discussed, I think the Goethe Institute was just incidental. It was around that area, so that's why I became a participant. I don't know much about how it operates in India, but I can give another example from the Philippines, for example, where in Manila, the Goethe Institute played a very important role in the 1980s, serving as a space for experimental film and actually doing workshops on that. So, yeah.
But also, one of the things, there's a very nice work by Nora Taylor about performance in Vietnam, in which she troubles this sort of rosy picture a bit in thinking about the nature of public space and whether the Goethe Institute constitutes a public space or not. And that, I think, is something that you really need to take on. In the Max Muller Bhavan in Bombay is an interesting example, I think, in terms of it's right next to the Jahangir Art Gallery, which is perhaps the most open public space for art that exists in India. It has a public bathroom, so it's very popular. Also air conditioning, so both things. And yeah, so these things are important. I'm totally serious that's why it's important. And Max Muller Bhavan is right next to it. And so it's relatively open, but in terms of foot traffic, it's a radical shift. People go to Jahangir, they do not go to Max Muller Bhavan unless they're going there with a purpose. So that's the other half of this. They're great spaces for the production of art, but they're not public spaces in the same way that, for instance, you're attempting to have with the workshop open days, etc. Right? Does it make sense?
So Gita and then Renata.
Okay, sorry. No, I just want to add a one-liner that the Max Muller Bhavan, the Goethe Institute in India, in Delhi, Bombay and Bangalore in particular, somewhat in Calcutta, are extraordinarily intelligent interventions. And I would disagree with Karen that it has less footfall. Of course, it has less footfall than Jahangir and Lalit Kala. But the question is, Khoj also, finally, has basically an artist footfall when they have open workshops. I mean, I made a map for Delhi for places where it was for a purpose of publication with an article. And I felt compelled map where activity takes place, which is out of the box, which is cutting edge, which is risky in a way that no other foreign intervention could be. Taking on issues that the government would oppose for any foreign institution. And I thought that Max Muller Bhavan had to be included in it. This encourage whatever avant-garde activity. It's extraordinary that a foreign institution could be doing that, and I think we should acknowledge that. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question here, Renata. Here.
Okay, first of all, thanks very much for these all very interesting papers and kind of the response as well. And it's sort of A question I have to Alnoor, which maybe also relates to everybody else. You seem to suggest that, I mean, this is my question to you. Was there a difference? You seem to suggest that the museums in the north maybe, basically you critique their understanding of South Asian culture, and yet they're trying in some way to engage with this community. Do you see a difference in how the museums or institutions in, let's say, in London engage with the public? Is this where you're trying to get to? And this would be then another question. We all, this was all, especially Eva's paper. Is there a similar? Do you see a dissimilar disconnect, or is there also a real? Obviously, you showed us how the Natural History Museum kind of didn't follow on maybe some knowledge one could have said one has gained. So really, it's sort of a question of trajectory, if that makes sense.
I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge the kind of work that has happened in the north of England, and I think that's sort of has been marginalised in certainly the kind of work that I was talking about, that happened in Manchester, in Yorkshire, where Nimmer was working, is working. I'm still referring to Cartwright Hall. You're not working at Cartwright Hall anymore. And in Liverpool, in Salford, these are kind of northern towns and cities where there isn't much recognition. And we have really snotty kind of, art reviewers, They don't come to Manchester, to review the work. I would argue that some of the project that we have curated has been incredibly significant. I'm sure Hamad will also. I mean, he mentioned the miniature painting show, and that was actually presented at, both in Manchester and in London, if I remember rightly. So that's the kind of point I was trying to make.
I think Nimmer, were you going to just respond briefly to that?
Very briefly, Alnoor, I was intrigued by your concluding paragraph where you talked about museums not recognizing currently. Are you talking about a new form of new colonialism by any chance? Is that what you were referring to? I didn't...
Yes, that's exactly what I was referring to. We have a new kind of form of colonialism in Manchester, where you have these so-called directors who are very much, they're not interested in collaboration, yet on the outside world, they talk about, how they want to collaborate. They're getting lots and lots of money from the Arts Council, but, they're not interested in people, like myself, Alice, with the kind of expertise that we've sort of developed over 2 decades, if not more, There is a kind of club culture, if you like.
Ava, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say quite quickly that I think funding is quite a big determining factor in a lot of these things, but I don't think it's just London versus the rest of the UK. I think it's more a phenomenon of the big cities. So it's not just London, it's London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester versus the smaller towns. So you do find quite a concentration of, I think, these kinds of cultural activities taking place in the big cities. But maybe Alice also wants to talk about that in her paper later on as well. Yeah.
I'm going to take 2 comments together, so Hamad and then Jai.
Yeah, so I think this is a comment that will segue into a question. The comment was that it is striking that in terms of the 3 presentations, and I'll sort of include Alnoor in that, and there was also a bit of a presentation in the response, was a sketching out of an elsewhere. And elsewhere from the exhibitionary space, but which actually ignores the exhibitionary space of Gasworks, because it is also an exhibitionary space. And in that residency itself is the open studio, which, whatever you call it, is still an exhibition of sorts. Yeah? So I think that got hidden or not discussed, and I think that's also important. The second bit, I think, which Alnoor has already underlined, but it's actually noticeable in the day and a half of presentations already. Although we've called exhibiting South Asia in Britain, we've only really addressed exhibiting South Asia in London. And I think we need to really, and Oxford, which we take within an hour right away. Yeah. So London and a quick, it ain't London. But I think the north, and for what Alnoor has actually just briefly outlined, it's a huge terrain with sort of deep histories. which are not being addressed at all. And I find that very strange.
Yeah, Hamad?
Yeah.
Hamad, I would also just add, sorry, that it's not just that, but it's also the communities that live in those areas. So there's a kind of deep connection to audiences, which perhaps is very different to what would be in London.
Absolutely. Jai, do you want to make your
yeah,
and then
it's
we'll
just an observation which probably will lead to not so much a question but a hope, I think. People have talked about the word diaspora, and Shehzad yesterday felt showed it was a problematic word. And as a kind of first generation immigrant here, of course, it's getting more and more atomized, with increasing mixtures of, people with multiple family backgrounds and so on. I think people have been talking about audiences in Britain, the whole of Britain. One thing people of so-called diaspora communities face here is racism, both on a personal and institutional level. And women especially, women of so-called South Asian backgrounds here, 25% more likely to commit suicide than women from other, the rest of the population. And I think so-called diasporan people here do have this kind of particular sense of belonging and not belonging. But I don't want to pose this as a completely negative thing. Salman Rushdie, for example, has written about how it does create certain freedoms to be in this kind of liminal space. And I think something very important that Alnoor has done with the Asia Triennial Manchester and numerous other projects is to combine artists not only from South Asia, but artists from the UK and elsewhere, and combine artists from other diasporan backgrounds as well, and showcase their work. And that is, they become role models, not only for people from South Asia, but from the communities in the UK, including women. So they see these people being successful from other cultures, and including women artists being successful. And I think that's really, really important. And in the light of the current Brexit, and I fear greater freedom that's already been reported in the press of people being able to express their racism, etc. I hope that, those initiatives can grow.
Thank you. Do any of our speakers want to respond?
I'd love to.
Yeah.
So I'll respond to Hamad and to the question of exhibition. There are two things, and obviously Alessio can speak better about this, but I'll do it anyway, which is that there's a distinction between the Gasworks exhibitionary program and the residency program. And South Asian artists have not, to my recollection, been part of the exhibitionary program. They have? Okay, but not, anyway. Not directly from the residency. And so what's interesting here is that distinction is a distinction that is about process, and it's about curatorial process. And I would say that there's a big difference between an open studio and an exhibition. And when I was speaking to Alessio about this, where he marked that difference is what happens to the residency itself when it's expected to produce an exhibition versus what happens in the residency when it's expected to produce an open studio day, which is that an open studio day is about process and an exhibition is about product. And that's actually one of the main interventions that we wanted to make in this is to bring that distinction forward with the presentation. Hamad cannot handle it. Yes. He will not brook this distinction.
We'll make it.
Yes, I think this distinction is overplayed. I think most of what passes as critical art in the contemporary art world is largely process-driven. So the idea that there is a distinction between a process and that somehow that becomes a commodity by simply calling it something else, I think is at best contested.
Oh, this is
Gosh.
good. We're getting going now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we can play with words. That's true. But in reality,
No, it's more than words.
No, it's more than words. But I mean, in terms of defining things, sorry. But I think in reality, the expectations that an artist feels, the burden perhaps, or the expectation of doing an exhibition is completely different. And also the exhibition space in Gasworks is curator-led now, and it has been to some extent before as well. And the Open Studio is not curator-led. It's driven by a kind of speculative, exploratory, research-based. Okay, you know, you've been to Open Studios where really there are a few things around and on tables and a few things pinned up on the wall. And yes, of course, they move into, you know, the artists will move that into, you know, a commercial gallery exhibition, or those ideas will lead to lots of things. But that particular space remains really, really kind of mobile and porous and speculative. And I can say that for a lot of the work in Vassal as well. And things change, you know, other residencies have emerged where they are completely exhibition driven. I mean, there's a residency in Pakistan where the artists really are pushed to produce work, and then it's exhibited in the gallery space and it is sold. So it's completely different, the pressure. And they say that this feels like a different thing. So, you know, it's the way you set it up, it's the way you talk about it, it's the way you step back as an organizer, as an you know, as a platform. And so I honestly think as a practitioner, it is a different space to occupy.
Ava, do you have something about just thinking about the spaces you were talking about in terms of that?
Well, the project that I discussed, it never really culminated in an exhibition per se. It was entirely about the process and about doing it. And I think I agree with Nisa that they differ. It's very much different from project to project, and that some do have more of an orientation than others, and that's for the person running it to decide. But actually, I wanted to go back to your point about diasporas, and I think the important thing to recognize here is that who's calling who a diaspora? Is it an institutional thing, labeling a group of people, or is it the individuals choosing to identify it as that? I mean, I technically also belong to a Bulgarian diaspora here as well, but I never think of myself in those terms, except whenever I have to tick official boxes. And one of the things that was coming out of Priceless was that this idea of the diaspora was something that the museum was pushing for, that the artists themselves would not necessarily have maybe chosen as their target audience a diasporic group. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for keeping energy levels and ideas high. And we have reached 1:30. We've got quite a tight slot for lunch, 1:30 to 2:30. We're having it back in the Paul Mellon Centre. So do come and join us. Everyone is welcome to come for lunch. But please join me in thanking our speakers and our respondents.